Hello, everyone. It is my great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. Nancy Spannaus is a public historian who has been studying American history with an emphasis on its economic development in general and Alexander Hamilton in particular since the 1970s. In 1977, she co-authored a book of writings on the political economy of the American Revolution. After retiring from a career in journalism, in 2019, she self-published the book Hamilton versus Wall Street: The Core Principles of the American System of Economics. In 2023, she self-published Defeating Slavery: Hamilton's American System Showed the Way. In 2017, Nancy established the blog AmericanSystemNow.com, which contains more than 600 articles on the history and principles of the American system of economics, including many original sources from advocates of that system, such as John Quincy Adams and Abraham Lincoln. Nancy is a graduate of Bryn Mawr College and Columbia University. She's a member of the Daughters of the American Revolution, the Alexander Hamilton Awareness Society, and the Lincoln Group of DC. This evening, we will have the pleasure to hear Nancy speak about her newest publication, From Subject to Citizen: What Americans Need to Know About Their Revolution. In this book, Nancy takes readers through three stages of the struggle: the growing revolt against the British Empire, the drafting of the Declaration, and the fight for the Constitution. Alexander Hamilton was present throughout these stages of the nation's birth, shaping both the fight for independence and the framework of government that followed. By challenging myths and examining the real ideas and conflicts of the Revolution, Nancy shows how Americans made the critical shift from subjects to citizens. Welcome, Nancy.
Thank you very much, Mariana. So this book I did about 6 months ago, and it is, I wrote it as a challenge with very much in mind the upcoming 250th anniversary of our country, and the conflicts and crises that we are stalemates in, you might say, that we're in politically. My own judgment was that the solution and that we require is to go back to the founding of this nation and take a much deeper look at what was actually being debated and the principles that were being applied. Because I believe that a lot of our citizens today have either forgotten or were never really immersed in that kind of knowledge. And as we know in the Alexander Hamilton Awareness Society, you know, a citizenry without knowledge is a citizenry which is unmoored. You have to have, we were founded on the basis of the necessity of continuous learning and advancement and progress, morally, intellectually, and physically. So I today will discuss the book from the standpoint of the role that Alexander Hamilton played in the various stages which were discussed. So this is the book, available on Amazon, $15, and full of 22 different articles, many of which were taken from the blog, because I realized that over the course of those 7 years, I'd written quite a bit polemically or expositively. A few are lengthy. A couple of the lengthy ones are on Alexander Hamilton. So, and they will be a lot of the subject of what I will be discussing tonight. So these are the 4 sections. You already heard what they are. The final one is a reiteration of the challenge that is represented by our need to reappropriate these ideas. And of course, we're all aware of the indispensable role Hamilton played in all the areas of this journey that the country went through, starting in the war and proceeding through the establishment of the Constitution and of the financial system as Treasury Secretary. So it's not surprising that we find him playing, that we have things to delve into in terms of his contribution. And I'm going to highlight his contribution in each of those particular areas, except the last. So the first thing, just to get straight though, is that we're not talking about the Revolutionary War. We're talking about the revolution, and that's something different than the actual war. A couple of the leading statesmen at the time made a special point of that. John Adams, for example, in 1811 said his view was that the revolution occurred in the minds of the people before a shot was fired. I think that's a slight exaggeration. If you see what he's saying here, that there was full confidence in the practicability of a union. That doesn't really account for the kinds of conflicts that we faced as we tried to pull that union together. But it has also a sharp ring of truth in terms of what was going on in the minds of the Americans over the period from 1760 to 1776 or 1775. And you had Benjamin Rush also made the same point with a different emphasis, saying, don't confound the revolution with the war. The war is over, the revolution is not. We have to establish forms of government that actually embed the principles and morals of the revolution in them so that we can bring it to perfection. And that, I think, is a sharper, more accurate view. So keep that in mind as we deal with the contributions of Alexander Hamilton here. Now, the first area I'm going to talk about, you've already gotten a thorough discussion of from the Ollers back in January, which is Alexander Hamilton's first 2 major political interventions around the conflict with Samuel Seabury after the First Continental Congress. And so I'm going to take these 2 documents, one of them written in December of 1774 and the other in February of 1775. And I'm not going to go through them in detail because the Ollers already have done that. But I'm going to give you a slightly different view of the contributions of these documents, which I believe lived on for in Alexander Hamilton's interventions and shaping of the revolution over the decades that followed. So I've identified these four principles that I think come through in those documents. The first is Hamilton's identification of the natural, that he's basing his arguments, and he claims that the First Continental Congress is basing its stance on the natural rights of mankind, or natural law. And I'll say more about that in a minute. The second is that to have the common good or general welfare at the center of your revolution requires national unity. The third is that slavery is an economic as well as a moral disaster. And the fourth is that the development of manufactures is vital to the survival of America as an independent nation. And in all those areas, he proceeded to fight for forms of government and understandings that would further those principles. On the question of, I'm going to talk about two of them in particular, the first and the last. The first, he attacks Seabury as saying, it sounds like you are a Hobbesian. Now, if you're familiar with the Hobbes, his basic idea was the only way that you can get human beings to behave themselves and not kill each other over getting what they want is to have a strong police state. And you had a slightly less violent point of view from a number of the so-called Enlightenment thinkers in England, Hume and Locke, who indicate that there's a state of nature in which there are no holds barred, where it's every man for himself. And the only way that you have civilization, any way you have concern for one human being for the other, is that you have a government that keeps control, or you have a social contract that agrees, where you agree that you won't kill each other. But there are no constraints in the state of nature. And he says this is absolutely not true. In the state of nature, there is morality demanded. It's demanded by the Creator, and you have no power to deprive anyone of his life or limbs or property or liberty, or to take control of him, have slavery. So he says this is a fundamental basis. There is a difference between natural rights, which is the idea that you tend to get from Hobbes and Locke, the emphasis on the individual, and natural law, in which you're talking about a coherent society, a cooperative society, where there are requirements, moral requirements for how you behave with other people. So the other very strong statement of that kind of commitment, which comes in the first document, the full vindication, is this poetic statement, probably the most poetic statement that Hamilton ever made, about how the sacred rights of mankind are written in human nature by the hand of divinity himself. So let's not consider human beings to be beasts. Let's consider them to be God-given people with God-given powers and responsibilities. And indeed, that idea of the responsibilities to the community is something that is required if you go from being a subject to a citizen. Now, the fourth element of those principles also really stands out when you read these documents. Because here before a shot is fired, Hamilton is defending the non-importation agreements, but he's doing it from the standpoint of saying that we could survive without any trade whatsoever with Great Britain, could become a great nation, because once we get our manufacturers together, we'll have a grand and glorious America. And this will make us even more secure against tyranny. And he elaborates, I believe that the authors went through this some, that we're very well endowed to do this. We have, if you look at the entire country, all the colonies at that time, there's no country, although he's talking about America as if it were a country. We have complementary strengths throughout the various colonies, and therefore we can have mutually advantageous intercourse. We can have national unity, which feeds the prosperity of everyone. And this is the pathway that we have to take. Obviously, an extremely important idea to build toward the creation of a nation out of these 13 relatively disparate colonies at that stage. So that'll be it for right now in terms of of section 1. Section 2 on the Declaration, Hamilton is not directly involved in this, but there are aspects of his writings and interventions that really draw from the uniqueness of the Declaration of Independence. Of course, the Declaration of Independence, as I go through in the book, is quite controversial today, even as it became controversial in America over the course of the 19th century. But let's look at it this way, because the Declaration, like the Constitution, has a preamble, and that preamble is this sentence. Importantly, this is all one sentence. You don't always find it punctuated in this way, but there has been considerable research done by a woman named Daniel Allen, whom I'll reference again later, that indicates that this is the original way it was written. It was intended not that you have the rights in one sentence and the governments are a different question. They are intricately related in order to ensure your inalienable rights, you have to have a government coherent with that idea. So, and that declaration, of course, is quite notable for its inclusion of the pursuit of happiness. That pursuit of happiness, of course, directly conflicts with the talk and formulation of the man that many people consider the guru of the American Revolution, John Locke. What he has to say is no one should harm each other in their life, health, liberty, or possessions, not pursuit of happiness, but property, life, liberty, and property. In fact, I've heard people say that's what the Declaration says. It just whips off their tongue in that regard. And that is really rips out something which is at the heart of the American experiment. Now, where did they get this idea of the pursuit of happiness instead of property? Well, in actuality, it goes back to the classical tradition, all the way back to Cicero and probably before that. And as you know, the Hamilton and the leading revolutionaries at the time were extremely conversant in the classical literature. Cicero's idea of natural law is very advanced from what we tend to think of today. All equal before the law, God-given abilities to attain to virtue, and that happiness, but his view of happiness is not individually, how do you feel? His assertion is that happiness comes from cultivating virtue in oneself and in one's society. In other words, the responsibility to contribute to the security and peace and happiness of others in your society and prosperity is part of what happiness is, as opposed to your happiness being in conflict with the happiness of others. Now, Hamilton had an affinity for this idea of happiness, and the fact that you don't want to give the free rein to private greed, which makes individuals happy. This is one example where he's talking about the national bank and defending, in a way, against those who oppose the bank, that we're not going to just let everybody get as rich as they can. The question is public utility or usefulness to the public or the public good. And there are many other examples of where he's talking about the importance of the happiness of our fellow citizens being the objective of the economic measures that he's proposing. You see, I include here the Washington cover letter, which I believe that Adam Levinson has made a strong case for having been written by Hamilton, also talking about freedom and happiness being the objective of the Constitution, and obviously reflecting that from the Declaration itself, as opposed to those who say that the Constitution is a defense of private property as opposed to the liberties being proposed in the Declaration of Independence. So these are your some examples of how he takes up from that seminal document. It didn't get lost, right? In terms of the revolutionary impetus going forward. This is this author, Danielle Allen. I saw her speak at a 250th a meeting devoted to how to celebrate or commemorate the 250th birthday of the country in Williamsburg a couple years ago. And she's done this extensive study on the Declaration, which is where she traced the fact that that whole first sentence is a sentence and that it is combined. It's all intended, as she says here, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness is intended to be linked to the consent of the governed and linked to affecting the safety and happiness of the country, not so that the sentence leads you to, from the individual to the community, that you can only achieve those individual rights if they're achieved as a society as a whole. Very important idea. It was not a libertarian document. And in fact, libertarian idea is pretty much the opposite of what our country was based on. And Hamilton's view, of course, is he's famously talked about how there is too much zeal for freedom and not enough concern for the vigor of national government. This is one of the quotes of that. But I think, as opposed to interpreting that in a way of he was really for dictatorship, looking at it from the standpoint of responsibility of the citizen to understand and is really the most competent way to look at it. Now, this last section on the Constitution is going to deal with a person who has been identified by Forrest MacDonald. He's a very competent biographer of Alexander Hamilton. He's now deceased. He wrote this maybe 40, 50 years ago. His biography. But he made some very important observations about Hamilton's intellectual development. And he points to the influence on Hamilton of this guy, Emmer Vattel, who was a Swiss natural law philosopher, diplomat, lawyer, and so forth. Vattel wrote an extensive book called The Law of Nations, but it doesn't simply deal with what the relationship should be between nations in terms of, laws of war and diplomatic activity and so forth. It also deals with how you organize your society internally. So he wrote this book in 1758 in French. It was translated almost immediately into English. It was spread internationally, read by the leaders of the revolution here. Very early, it was known to have been read by Hamilton, at least by 1782. So in that formative period of going up until the Constitution, Vattel was, Hamilton was quite familiar with Vattel. And Vattel actually was the most cited authority in the constitutional debates and the legal debates going on for decades. Many, many people have never heard of him today. That's really a shame, as you will see. So MacDonald says that Vattel allowed Hamilton to really crystallize views that he otherwise intuited, right? Where he had this idea of natural law, he got a more thorough elaboration on how that worked from reading Vattel. These are the core ideas of Vattel. Again, the great end of every being is happiness. But for happiness, you have to fulfill your obligation to society as a whole. The great end is the common advantage of all its members. And you have to observe that, and that's what makes you happy. Now, Vattel also had also laid out the responsibilities of government. Principal objects of good government: provide for the nation's necessities, which means an active role for government, procure the true happiness of the nation, fortify yourself against external attacks. And these are very similar to some of the major responsibilities of government that Hamilton lays out in the Report on Manufactures, for example, where here he says we need to provide, the government has to ensure that we possess all the essentials of national supply: subsistence, habitation, clothing, and defense. He also has those references to the importance of achieving through those economic measures and others a happiness and security in the population. And, on that idea of the general welfare, which is ensuring that there is not dog-eat-dog competition, but a complementary contribution to the national wealth. You have this emphasis on the general welfare, which was, I can't say for sure that Hamilton was responsible for putting that in the preamble of the Constitution, but we know he was heavily involved in drafting that preamble to the Constitution on the Committee of Style. And that commitment to promoting the general welfare is the only objective that appears twice in the US Constitution, once in the preamble and once in the duties of Congress. So it shouldn't be ignored. And Hamilton would go out of his way to underscore that commitment. Sometimes he called it the public good. This comes from the opinion on the constitutionality of the National Bank, where he's saying that we should be liberal with our spending of money in advancement of the public good. It's the responsibility of government to ensure that the general welfare is served and advanced. And then the last on national defense. Interestingly enough, Hamilton was not only among the first to propose a military academy, but he also purchased the land in 1791 on which West Point was eventually built. I learned that fairly recently. This, of course, is his promotion of national defense is seen as an indication of him being a militarist, but obviously not. He was doing what is required in a world full of empires. And then the last point that is pointed out in by Forrest MacDonald is that Vattel himself also puts forward the idea of judicial review. That idea being that not only should your government be responsible for following natural law, but your government should also be responsible for following its constitution. So Hamilton was very well known for pushing for judicial review. The first case was the Waddington-Rutgers case. Others came later, which means that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, not any particular person or party in power. So this idea is one that Hamilton contributed to our national existence, and which is in danger in some sense of being lost today, I believe. Now, the final section of the book really does not, it is quotes from two figures coming much later than Hamilton. Lincoln, of course, is a Hamiltonian, was a Hamiltonian, not just in economics, but also, I believe, in many of his beliefs about the functioning of government. And when he was faced in 1838 with the explosion of mob rule, of attacks on immigrants, of attacks on abolitionists, people taking the law into their own hands, he gave this speech to a youth in Illinois, where he talks about how we can save our Republican institutions, which is what we've been talking about in terms of the founding of our government. And I run the whole speech. I really highly recommend it. It concludes with a very sharp statement about the need for education, reason, education, morality, reverence for the Constitution and laws. He uses as an example of that, of course, Washington, but we all know who Washington's pen was, and that, and I think we can associate, I think Hamilton would heavily endorse this conclusion. And the final piece is by a friend of Abraham Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, who emphasizes, whom I don't quote his full speech because he didn't give a speech on this. He wrote it in his autobiography. paean basically to education. True knowledge unfits a man to be a slave. If you're not familiar with the story, I'll tell you quickly, and then we can conclude. What Frederick, Douglass was a slave when he was sent to Baltimore to a household. The woman in the household decided that she should teach him to read. She was teaching her own child to read, and he was interested, and he was doing very well. And she bragged to her husband about how well he was doing. And her husband went berserk. Her husband said, "What are you doing? If you teach this boy anything, he's going to be unfit to be a slave." And unfortunately for him, Frederick heard that and said, "Aha, okay, if knowledge unfits someone to be a slave, then that's what I'm going to get." And he devoted much of his life to demanding that education of the mind be at the core of the raising of the level of the Black population and of everyone else. So these are ideas that I believe also would resonate with Alexander Hamilton, who himself, as a self-made man, self-educated man like Douglass and Lincoln, made his mark by ensuring that he that he learned, that he developed his mind, and he used it to serve his nation. So that's it.
Thank you, Nancy. That was so incredible. I don't think everyone realizes how fortunate we are today that Nancy not only is here presenting about her book, but that she made a specific special presentation just for us, calling out Hamilton's role in this really powerful book. And so I just really want to extend our thanks to you, Nancy, for doing this tonight. And it's I think we all know it's a very timely book, and it's so important through any period of time that we're aware as citizens. And I really love the title, From Subject to Citizen. Could you talk a little bit about how you came to that title?
Sure. Well, there's a long article in the book, actually, of which that's a partial title. It's a speech that I was given the permission to republish, that was given at the Fort Plain American Revolution Conference 2 years ago. And it was on the First Continental Congress, which it was an amazing speech, because what he showed was that the measures taken in the fall of 1774 has almost made us a nation, because following that, not only did we have the non-importation agreements, but we stopped paying taxes to the British authorities. We began to establish our own military force. We set up committees to police and to monitor what was going on with trade and so forth. His argument is that a lot of those measures actually succeeded in beginning to shift us and explicitly to shift us to people who were patriotic for their country, as opposed to individual rebels, right? Or, who are still subjects. They may be subjects of their emotions, but, they're still subjects. So that's where I got that that idea, and then also just my own thought the uh, about the connection between being a citizen and having responsibility to know not just who your congressman is or something like that, or who the presidents were, but know what the policies were, what policies are being debated. I read a study once, not too long ago, where a man was arguing that we had a shift in this country in the 1920s. He said that early, that prior to the 1920s, and you'll remember this from what you've read about the Lincoln period and so forth, people were passionate about policies of the government. Was there going to be a tariff or not? Was there going to be a gold standard? Was there going to be a silver standard? What were we going to, was there going to be a national bank? We had, when the national bank was eliminated in 1833, people sent in memorials from all over the country saying, I'm being, devastated by the fact I can't get any credit anymore. People were fixed on these things, and involved. He said that in the 1920s, we had a tendency to shift to a consumer society. So from that period, people began to think, well, how much does this cost and how much does that cost? And can I afford another house? And can I afford this and that? And get much less involved in the actual policy questions and obviously that creates a big problem, right? Because you're setting yourself up to get if not an oligarchy, but a kind of class distinction that is a problem, and then you can get very upset about what policies are then taken out and what effect they have on you, but you've contributed to that by the fact of your own neglect of your responsibilities. So I really like the From Subject to Citizen.
Well, that's wonderful. Well, while I invite other questions in the chat, I did have another question sort of touching on what you were speaking about, which is how interesting the focus of the revolution was really in the years prior to what we tend to think of as the revolution, and sort of that distillation of all of the Enlightenment thought from these European philosophers and people like Vattel that are not really covered as much nowadays. And so just sort of curious on how you view that transfer of the European thought and how it found a place to really take the experiment was able to be held here before other places, if that was part of your research.
Yeah, in the course of doing this book, I read a lot of the English Whig writings of the 1720s, which I had never read before. Of course, there was incredible work done by Bernard Bailyn on a historian who said, we've got to find out what they were reading and thinking about during the revolution. And he in the 1950s did a book on, he read through, all the newspapers, and he read through looked at the pamphlets, and he looked at, well, what were they reading? Well, and what were they discussing, and what were they, writing about, and so forth. So the one thing that, I was familiar with Milton, right? I was familiar with some of the other writings, but not these 1820s. The Cato's Letter, I don't know if you're familiar with that, but according to Beilin, those were probably among the most quoted uh, newspaper and publications here. So it is interesting, and this whole idea of the rights of Englishmen, which I always poo-pooed, right? And poo-pooed the idea that there was a constitution in Britain. Well, there's an unwritten constitution. They hardly believed that they had a constitution, and it meant that only the parliament could do the taxes and only, et cetera, et cetera. So it was interesting to me that I think they exaggerated how much those rights were actually implemented. I mean, they were there in mind, right? But what they believed they should do is put them into effect here, but they went further, right? They went further and they became Republican, and that's one of the things that I was going to mention in the Seabury back and forth with Hamilton. I mean, he makes a point, why, you guys are sounding Republican. You're sounding like a Republican, small r, and as if it's a swear word, right? But that's obviously where they were headed.
I know that's so interesting. I'm curious from your perspective, as your book is focused on what Americans need to know about the revolution. What do you think Alexander Hamilton in particular wished citizens today knew about the revolution?
Wow. Well, he would. I mean, I just think people have really got to read. I mean, they've really got to go back and look at those founding documents seriously. I mean, one of the interesting things about that woman with the Declaration of Independence, she came up with her ideas because she used to teach English as a second. She used to teach immigrants, and she had to teach them about the founding documents. So, but what she would do with them is they would read out loud, I guess because they had English, more English problems, and go through step by step what some of the elements were in that document, and and it just opened up a whole world to her in terms of what was involved in. I mean, it wasn't just written by 5 people. She said, think of all the people who elected the people who had to agree on this. I mean, we all know, and there's an article there that the first time that this whole idea of independence came up, they said, "Oh, well, we don't have a majority. We don't have a unanimity. We've got to hold off for a month now and see if we can get it together," right? So there was a lot. There was a fight for it because they felt they really had to have it in order to get international support for the revolution. So I mean, I think he would say, get serious and read so that you know what you're talking about, as opposed to just, I mean, despite his own flying off when he flew off the handle, it was a $40,000 word article that came out. But nowadays, when people fly off the handle, it's much less erudite. It's much less.
You only have 200 characters, so.
Oh, right. It's to go. So
Well, thank you so much, Nancy, for this wonderful, all the work you put into your presentation today. And you've received a lot of compliments in the chat here. And again, I want to encourage you, if you have not already
let me
picked up.
look at it, chat. I haven't seen the chat at all.
Okay, I'll make sure to send you the messages afterwards so you can see them.
Okay, okay. Well,
So
I'd
we
like
do have.
I encourage you all to, if you would, to buy a book. I also encourage you to look at the blog and subscribe, because that's free. And I also take contributions, you know, from people like you guys. Like, you know, I've run a, I wrote one. I know I ran at least one of Dick Silla's articles from a long time ago, but so I'd appreciate any kind of support for that, and support for the book, because it is timely, and it is and things are not coming together in this country. Let's put it that way. At the
Well, if you'd
moment.
like to pick up the book, if you have not already, it's From Subject to Citizen: What Americans Need to Know About Their Revolution. Thank you to Michael Newton for putting the link to purchase it on Amazon right in the chat. So if you have
Thank
not
you,
already,
Michael.
although I do see Marianne L saying she's reading the book right now, Nancy. So that is wonderful. And Elizabeth mentions, thank you for part 4, the challenge. I needed that. So I hope you all pick up the book, get inspired. Thank you again, Nancy. And we hope to see you back next week for our presentation on Hamilton and finance, which builds off of Hamilton's vision for independence, which included that economic component. So thank you again for being here this evening, and we hope to see you again soon.
And I'll see you then.
Thank you.
I'll see you then. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.